Firstly, I should introduce myself. I'm Jenny Davis. I'm a past co-director of RIEL. Unfortunately, our current director of RIEL cannot be here today. I assume he's off somewhere having a relaxing holiday. I hope he is. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce this group of talks, not just one talk, on gender research at RIEL. And Natasha gave me some notes. So gender-related issues have been studied here at CDU and in RIEL since around 2008. So there's quite a history now of undertaking this kind of research. There are a number of HDR students who have been working on projects in Indonesia and East Timor over that time. So as a University of the North, I think it is one of the great examples of how we're not just connected in Northern Australia, but we're also connected to the countries to our north, which is incredibly important. Most of this work, or a lot of this work, has been carried out through gender networks that exist through various platforms. So the two main platforms are fisheries and agriculture. And so the work has also been funded by various agricultural and fisheries agencies. The work undertaken by researchers, Natasha, and HDR students is being published in Q1 journals, which again is also incredibly important for CDU. And I just noticed an email came through this morning, I think, from Simon Moss, saying that from now on we're also going to have HDR students who are involved effectively in internships to get scholarships. And really what's been happening with this program is already a good example of where people are really quite embedded in agencies and the kind of research that is translating to make a difference. I'll stop talking and it's time to introduce our first speaker, which I presume is number one on the... No, okay. Who's our first speaker? Jenny. Right, all right, leave you to
it. Thanks everyone for being here today. Our first speaker will be Emily, but before we get to that, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction for today's seminar. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, the Larrakia people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So there have been lots of conversations about gender and gender equity at CDU over recent weeks. And today we would like to take this opportunity to talk about the case for considering gender in environmental research, which is very relevant for those of us in RIEL. So today's speakers will be talking about what that can bring to environmental research and also some of the ways that we can go about doing that. But before I get into that, I think we're ready. I think you're old enough. I think it's time to have the talk, okay? So first we're going to talk about what is sex. Sex is the biological and physiological characteristics that define male and female animals. So these are things like hormones, chromosomes, etc. But it's really important to know that there is some diversity within that. Although we tend to think of this as a binary system, it's important to recognize that human diversity is beautiful, wonderful, and it's there. Gender is something slightly different. It's culturally and socially ascribed attributes, roles, activities, and responsibilities, which are associated with being male or female, and in a particular space or time. So the difference between, one of the differences between gender and sex is that gender changes depending on your context. Gender is a story we tell ourselves about who we should be. And so when we mix up these topics, it can lead to some problems and some confusion. So now that we're all experts in sex and gender, I'm gonna ask you a little quiz that I've borrowed from my supervisor, Danica. I'm going to posit a situation and then ask you to raise your hand if you think that it's related to sex or gender. In Gambia, women prefer to plant vegetable gardens and men prefer to plant fruit orchards. So raise your hand if you think this is an example of sex and gender. Amazing. Great work. And next, in Germany, 90% of infants were breastfed by women, 0% of infants were breastfed by men. So put your hand up if you think this is an example of sex and gender. Okay, great. So we're starting off well. So when we think about gender in environmental research and the implications that it might have, we need to think about social norms. Social norms are the unwritten rules of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that are considered acceptable in a particular society or culture. One aspect of this is gender norms, which are ideas about how women and men, boys and girls, should be and act. And these ideas constrain our gender identity based on our context. So norms can be positive, for example, the norm that children shouldn't smoke cigarettes, but they can also be a source of inequality in society. And these play out in gender relations, which define how people should interact with others and relate to one another, depending on their attributed gender. So when you talk about gender with gender specialists, they'll try and tell you that gender is not just about women, it's not just a women's issue, and then we'll give a whole talk about women. So why is that? Why do we do that? Well, it's because when you're trying to compare two things and you don't have any data on one of those things, then you start to focus on that aspect. So the reason that we always talk about women when we're talking about gender is because we just don't have enough data about women and their activities. So in gender research, we often focus on women in an effort to catch up. But considering gender is much more nuanced than just comparing genders. Intersectionality provides us with a way of understanding how different social characteristics and power dynamics can play out in our research. The concept of intersectionality encompasses a broad range of social characteristics, identities, and differentiations that can include sex, race, age, ability, sexual orientation, class, and gender identity, for example. Intersectionality means that these different identities combine to shape how each individual moves through the world. It helps us to ask the right questions in our research about who has access to resources, assets, and decision-making power, and to ask why. Gender is everywhere. And these questions play out in various aspects of environmental research and natural resource management. But it's only there if we look for it. As soon as we consider humans to be part of the ecosystem, we need to consider gender. The literature shows that this is a cross-cutting issue that impacts resource use, vulnerability to ecosystem impacts or climate change, livelihoods, governance, management, and it even shapes how people perceive and value ecosystem services. So speaking with women and men is essential if we want to understand these issues and ensure we're doing the most useful research. So I hope you're starting to see the relevance of gender in environmental research and management. And I'd like to draw attention to the fact that there are many different motivations for why we should consider gender, and that these can be divided into two categories. The first is instrumental motivations. So much of what I've already said would fit into this category. These motivations value gender equality as a means to an end, because it can lead to improvements in productivity, management, and conservation, for example. In contrast, intrinsic motivations are about pursuing gender equity because of values around justice and fairness, because it's the right thing to do. It's a valuable goal in and of itself. And if I haven't convinced you yet, I've got a final instrumental motivation for you, which is that gender inclusion makes conservation and management, makes research and management better. These papers show how gender and social diversity, these two on the end here, show how gender and social diversity can lead to better research. The third paper there shows how gender-inclusive management can lead to better conservation outcomes. And this final one is an example of how including women's knowledge can lead to better biodiversity research and decision-making. So I feel like I've given a bit of an overview there, and now we'll get into some of the individual speakers. So now I'm going to be handing over to Emily. She's on Zoom. So I'll just get her video up here.
Today I'm going to talk about the gender dimensions of natural resource use in the context of livelihoods and small-scale fisheries. And I'll talk briefly about one component of my research. So to start with, a livelihood refers to the assets, the activities, and the access to these that together determine the living gained by a household. So a household might engage in a diverse portfolio of livelihood activities, or be highly specialised. And the former are often referred to as desirable for spreading risk and reducing vulnerability. However, livelihood strategies are enabled or hindered by local and distant institutions, by gendered social relations, which Jenny's been explaining, the economic or market structure, and the political and ideological superstructure. And this includes things such as the natural resource management regime and people's ability to access common pool resources such as fisheries. Next slide, please, Jenny. So women's and men's ability to access, control, and benefit from natural resources in particular affects their ability to earn a livelihood. And these factors have been identified as barriers in progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially in the ability of households to move out of poverty. Access includes things such as physical access to natural resources, such as a fishing ground or an area of forest, access to education and training opportunities, even access to markets and market information. Control includes things such as the ability to make decisions about an asset, such as what to plant in a field or where to sell a harvest and on what terms. The ability to exclude others from a natural resource through customary tender systems or formal management regimes, and the ability to participate and contribute to decision making about the use of different natural resources. And benefits include things such as securing basic needs, the generation of income and the ability to control that income, gaining and sharing knowledge, and using or earning political power. Differential access, ability to access, control and benefit from the use of natural resources arises from a range of factors, including gender norms and social relations. And this affects how women and men use different parts of a seascape or other ecosystems. So this picture is taken from a study in Zanzibar, which mapped gendered use of a seascape stretching from the terrestrial forest down through a mangrove forest, across the seagrass beds, the coral reef, and out into the deep sea. While it's probably too small to read, you can see that both men and women used the terrestrial coastal forests quite often in different ways, but use of the deep sea was an activity that only men did, so only men were involved in capture fisheries. Patterns of use can vary between communities and also over time, and the failure to understand where, when, how and why people use seascapes can have perverse outcomes. So for example, a failure to identify an area of coral reef as important for women's gleaning could result in the loss of access to important food sources. So a couple of studies in South Pacific nations have identified this occurring, where women weren't consulted about the use of coastal resources, and tenure maps were drawn up and restrictions were imposed, and that had a big impact on women's ability to harvest food for their families. Gender norms and social relations also affect how men and women participate in small-scale fisheries value chains. Women's participation in particular has historically been invisible. This has been due to a broader research focus on fisheries biology and management, and this generally has had a greater interaction with men's at-sea capture fishing. However, women make up about half of all workers involved in small-scale fisheries, and in many contexts, they often dominate in processing and marketing of fish. So my research, it sought to investigate the gendered contribution of small-scale fisheries activities, household livelihoods in some fishing communities in a remote part of Indonesia. And the research was conducted in Labuan Bajo, which is in Komodo district in Nusa Tenggara Timur, in the tiny little red box on that map. And that's just some pictures showing the appearance of the communities. I mapped out men's and women's livelihood activities using a household survey, and a wide range of activities were identified, but it was dominated by men's participation in capture fishing and associated supporting services. So men participated in 10 different capture fishing activities, targeting different species. So some were in the nearshore coastal environment, things like abalone and sea cucumbers, whereas others were out in the deep sea. These men typically identified a primary fishing practice and engaged in a secondary fishing practice depending on their recent success, the tidal cycles and the season. Women in 2/5 of households did pursue income generating livelihood activities, but these were generally home-based food businesses or micro trading enterprises. So women didn't go out to sea. They even didn't glean, which was quite a surprising finding from the research. But they did exercise agency in choosing to pursue an income generating activity, and they were able to direct the money that they earned towards their children's education. Participation in livelihood activities was affected by a range of intersectional factors. So gender norms and expectations flowed strongly from the Bajo culture and religion. And the quotes on the screen there just show sort of men's job was really perceived as being in the ocean, and the women stayed home and looked after the household. However, women did participate right throughout small-scale fisheries value chains, and this participation was often unpaid and undervalued. So women would be taking out fishing equipment for their husbands. They would be meeting them at the pier when they came back. They would be repairing equipment, involved in processing and drying fish and sea cucumber, and also involved in the marketing and sale of fish. So in the main township, Labuan Bajo, a lot of women were involved in small market sales. It's also important to think about women's time burdens and men's time burdens. In these communities, women bore the bulk of reproductive responsibilities, so they were responsible for all of children's care and homemaking activities. But then, as I indicated, they also engaged in a whole range of unpaid activities that directly supported men's fishing. And then in addition to that, they took on these small income generating activities, which were really important in supplementing household income during poor fishing times. I also mapped the flow of fish. This diagram might be a bit difficult to see clearly on the screen, but that was another way of mapping and identifying men's and women's participation in small-scale fisheries value chains, and looking at differences in participation and thinking about why that might be occurring. Just in conclusion, in the case study communities, there was significant dependence on income from capture fisheries activities, and thus it would have been really important to have some sort of management framework in place to make sure that resources were being used sustainably. Excuse me. However, fishers were often in highly vulnerable positions, including in patron-client relationships where they had limited access to market information, and there was some strong pressure to continue harvesting fish to pay off the loans that they had from their patrons. The other thing, the other sort of interesting finding from the research was that it can be really difficult to design alternative lively opportunities for these small communities, or to engage them in alternatives, because there was such dependence on fishing. If fishing wasn't successful, there was no money within the community to support other activities. So fishing was really central, and thus it was really important for it to be well managed. I think I'll leave it there, Jenny. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so now that we understand that there are gender differences in how people utilize and interact with the environment, I'd like to discuss a little bit about how this relates to studying the environment using participatory monitoring. So there are lots of different forms of participatory monitoring, and there are so many different terms that different disciplines use to describe it. And these range from terms like Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge to terms like collaborative research projects and joint research. Participatory monitoring might incorporate ecological surveys, observations, or even experiential knowledge that people have built up about an ecosystem over time. The level of participation that community members can have in terms of collecting the data can follow this spectrum.
Because I got Olivia here.
There we go, sorry about that. Yeah, so the level of participation is on this spectrum. So it ranges from data being sampled by others. So an example of that would be external researchers coming in to collect data about a community, up to providing data themselves, or carrying out enhanced sampling as part of a collaborative research arrangement, sorry. And it can even involve participatory governance regimes, which are about collecting knowledge together, and a system which incorporates everyone's voice in decision-making and requires and respects other forms of knowledge. I'm not saying that one of these is always the best option. It depends on your program goals and your research questions, but these are some of the options that we can choose from. So the purpose of participatory monitoring is often multifaceted. It can be a useful and cost-effective data collection tool in data-poor systems. It can also be an entry point for community engagement in management or research, and it enables informed decision-making. And it can also be an empowering process for the participants themselves. Participatory monitoring can enable community members to respond to their own interests and concerns at various stages of the data collection and monitoring process, from collecting the data to analyzing and understanding it through to making decisions. So from a gender perspective, participatory monitoring can provide many benefits. In Aswani and Wyant's paper, they show how participatory monitoring can help women manage the resources which they rely on, as women's needs and priorities can often be overlooked if management is carried out solely by men. It can also be an opportunity to capture some of the gendered ecological knowledge that exists, because we know that women and men often have different specialist knowledge about particular species or habitats. It can also be a pathway for creating opportunities for women's participation in management. In this paper from a male-dominated fishery in South Africa, acting as data collectors in a monitoring program enabled women to have a voice in management decisions that they otherwise wouldn't have had a say in. However, participatory monitoring is not a silver bullet. There are also some risks involved as well. So in Agarwal's work on participatory exclusions in forestry management, she shows that women participating in management activities such as enforcement or monitoring might not necessarily translate into increasing their decision-making power. So this activity-specific participation means that women have to do lots of extra work of management without having increased power in the decision-making process. So in this case, it just adds time burden and cost to their already busy lives. A final consideration is the risk of appropriating local knowledge. This can happen when participatory monitoring becomes about extracting local knowledge for our own benefit as researchers. So to delve into some of these issues in more detail, I'd like to share a framework which I've been developing as part of my PhD research on participatory monitoring in community-based fisheries management through a gender lens. Catchy title, I know. So the vertical axis here in this framework is about the experience of the participants. So being involved in monitoring can be a marginalizing experience all the way up to an empowering experience. And on the horizontal axis, we have on the left, the horizontal axis is about how the knowledge is treated in the system. So on the left, the local knowledge is oppressed, not taken seriously or dismissed. On the right, we have different forms of knowledge coexisting. They're all valued and utilized when making decisions. So some examples of what this might look like. In the top right quadrant, we can see a scenario where participatory governance is grounded in Indigenous and local knowledge, as well as Western science, and everyone has a voice in making decisions. In the bottom left quadrant, we have a situation where management only accepts Western science, and people are excluded from decision making. And then somewhere in the middle, we have assimilating knowledge, and this could look like participatory monitoring, involving people in collecting data using Western scientific methods, but then not translating that into those people having a greater say in making decisions as a result of that monitoring program. So here's an overview of the rest of my research for my PhD. So the framework that I just presented is from this first global scale research objective. I'm currently working on a paper about community-based fisheries management in Timor-Leste, in particular looking at the governance of fisheries and how communities participate in management from a gendered perspective. Next will be some community-level case studies, and then using participatory photography to explore individual women's experiences of participating in fisheries monitoring. And that will be with this Women's Fisheries Monitoring Program in Timor, which I set up with the Marine Conservation NGO Blue Ventures in 2018, and now includes 5 fisheries monitoring groups around the country. So if you're thinking that participatory monitoring could be a useful tool in your research, I'd like to share a few top tips that I've learned from my experience. First of all, we need to consider human ethics. Even if you're studying animals or ecosystems, can really be a valuable process, even if the university doesn't require you to do it. Next, talk to and work with people of all genders. That's how you're going to have the best conversations and collect the most useful knowledge. Also, consider the local context. There might be social norms that you don't know about, and if you're not sure, ask. And finally, be humble. You might be an expert in your field, but that doesn't mean you're the expert in every situation or context. So take the time to listen and learn from others. Earlier this year, I contributed to a toolkit about how to collect and share data with community members. I think it was linked in one of the newsletters. So I'd really recommend having a browse through that if you're interested in utilizing some of these approaches. I'm happy to discuss any ideas. And I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors and the organizations and groups which are involved in this research. Now, I'll hand over to Gianna.
Hi, good afternoon. All right, so I'm thankful for the opportunity to discuss empowerment and present some results from my second PhD paper. Yeah, and so my topic is about measuring women's empowerment in agriculture, and you may ask yourself, but why? Well, agriculture is the leading productive sector for rural populations in most low and middle income countries, and it's a major source of livelihoods in rural areas. In such countries and in rural areas, there's a concentration of extreme poverty in a disproportionate manner. So poverty often begins with poor health and nutrition, which result in a vicious cycle. And so, as has been said before, empowerment is important as an end goal in itself, and as an end goal in itself to realize gender equality and social justice, but as well as a means by which to accomplish other development outcomes such as poverty alleviation or, for example, improving nutrition in my case. But it could be to improve conservation, biodiversity conservation. And but let's start. What is empowerment? So this is defined as expanding people's ability to make strategic life choices, particularly in contexts in which disability has been denied to them. And so in this definition, the ability to exercise choice, which is the core aspect of empowerment, encompasses three interrelated dimensions: resources, agency, and achievement. So to be empowered, a person needs access to resources, and this can be human, social, natural, physical. So a person needs to access resources and then needs to have agency. And so agency is the ability to influence in decision-making processes. So for example, deciding the number of children one wants to have, or if someone, if you can sell or keep a buffalo. It's the ability to view viewpoints, which is related to attitudes about genders and social norms as we've seen. So for example, in some contexts, women can be socially seen as expert knowledge keepers in medicine plants, whereas in others, it may be inappropriate for women to talk about certain topics like fishing because it's only a men's domain. And agency is also the ability to act autonomously, example, having freedom of movement. So last, to be empowered, a person also needs to have achievements, which is the capacity to influence outcomes. So for example, in my case would be nutrition, but that could also be natural resource management for sustainable livelihoods. So empowerment requires a level of material resourcing and the ability to make choices over those. Next. However, measuring empowerment is not easy. Quantifying and comparing across contexts is difficult, as empowerment can have different meanings depending on the sociocultural, economic, and political landscape that people live in. So this is a social construct, and traditionally it has been investigated through proxy indirect measures such as education, income, employment. And over time, direct measures of empowerment, particularly around decision-making and control indicators, have become more sophisticated. So now we'll present one of these tools, because as we know, if you can measure it, you can't improve it. So the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or WEAI, measures the inclusion of women in the agriculture sector, really relevant in low middle income countries. It's a surveys-based index interviewing men and women in the same household, so looking at the relational aspects of empowerment, not just women in themselves, but men and women in their own setting. And in terms of methodology, it's quite similar to the multidimensional poverty indexes. Next, the WEAI score is an aggregated index, which is designed to measure 5 domains in agriculture: production, resources, income, leadership, and time. There's a lot of decision-making into how those are managed. And so that has a different number of indicators, and then there's weights. So you can construct this WEAI score, and then you can disaggregate it in 2 sub-indexes: the 5 domains of empowerment, or 5D, which reflect the percentage of women who achieved an 80% threshold of adequacy or more. And then there's the gender parity sub-index, which reflects the inequality between the 5D score between men and women in the same, between a man and a woman in the same household, looking at the gender relations aspect of it. And also, this tool was born in 2012, and multiple versions have been developed, like the abbreviated WEAI and the Pro WEAI. So now, I will present very briefly the results from a study applying the abbreviated version of the WEAI, which investigated the relationship between measures of women's empowerment in agriculture and household food production, so for the agriculture piece, on the dietary diversity of children and women among smallholders in rural Timor-Leste. So the methods that we used, the nutrition outcomes that selected were the dietary diversity scores of women and children, and explanatory variables included the 3 aggregate empowerment indicators of the AWEAI and 6 individual indicators, so that's 9 models, and then also the production diversity index, which is the number of food groups produced by the household. So we applied OLS multivariable regression models and controlled for individual, household, and agrogeographic characteristics. And I just wanted to include this equation because for the hard scientists in the room, yes, we can measure empowerment with equations. How cool is that? Okay, let's have a look at what we found. So we found small gender gaps in production decisions, access to resources, and income control. And this is quite similar to findings in other Southeast Asian countries. And we contribute with further evidence on this pattern of gender relations in agriculture that are quite fairly equitable compared to other contexts like in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. And then very quickly, I'm just going to explain the simplified results from the regression models. And so we found basically that the being empowered, the binary indicator, so for women, was associated with higher children's as well as women's dietary diversity scores by close to half a food group, which is a fair bit. However, the aggregated empowerment score, or the 5DE, was only significant for women but not for children, probably due to our small sample size. And then production diversity was strongly significant with children's diets. So we found that different measures might be important for the dietary quality, as our mixed results show. In Timor-Leste, which is consistent with the literature in other LMIC, meaning that we need to look at empowerment contextually because it changes across countries. Okay, next. So to conclude, this study found that women's empowerment in agriculture, different measures, emerge as significant factors in the achievement of dietary outcomes. And the results of this applied research aim to inform nutrition-sensitive policies and programs in Timor-Leste. And also, I conclude that if you're into the biophysical sciences, you can still have fun measuring women's empowerment despite being a social construct. So yeah, thanks to all the participants, research team, partners, funders, supervisors who made this research possible, as well as to this little one who's been crunching the numbers with me for the last little while. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Gianna. Okay, lucky last. I'll be quick. Next slide. Thanks, Jenny. So I wanted to briefly talk to you about a research project that we actually completed a couple of years ago in collaboration with colleagues in Indonesia and Murdoch University, shown here on the photo. It was a small research activity funded by ACR from 2015 to 2017. And we produced a final report that's quite large. It's available on the ACR website, but out of that final report, we've distilled the findings into 2 papers. The first paper that was published in Maritime Studies Journal is the one that I'm going to briefly overview today. And the second paper, if you could just go back, Jenny, the second paper, which is focused more on the constraining and enabling factors we found in our study on small-scale fisheries, livelihoods and projects that have been implemented, actually came out this afternoon, which is kind of cool. It's been in review for a long time. So yeah, this paper co-authored with colleagues and including Emily, who also contributed a lot to this project, and our papers was focusing on the way that gender had been considered in a variety of coastal livelihood programs that had been implemented in Indonesia. So as Emily and others have alluded to in her talk, that Indonesia is the second highest fish producing country in the world. There's millions and millions of people involved in fisheries and millions of people involved in small-scale fisheries, and those fisheries provide major livelihood contributions. It's hard to get, good estimates of how many women and men are involved in small-scale fisheries in Indonesia, but, up to at least 50%. However, as other speakers have pointed out, women are often underrepresented in management, policy, governance, and livelihood programs. So sustaining fisheries livelihoods is a major priority for Indonesia, and there's been considerable efforts made to try and improve coastal livelihoods in communities, looking at ways of enhancing or diversifying or bringing in new alternative livelihoods to address, these range of pressures and threats on marine resources from a whole range of areas, and to generally, strengthen well-being of communities. And we know that gender is very crucial to achieving and maintaining livelihoods, but that most recently, well, in the last decade, really, gender has been overlooked, and women have been considered as invisible in many of the fisheries and aquaculture sectors around the world. But it's only in the last 10, 15 years that more focus has been given to gender and fisheries, and that's been partly due to some amazing people that have worked really hard, volunteered for a long time to set up things like gender fisheries networks, host conferences, work with international organisations that we've been able to be part of, that's sort of been supporting our research here in Darwin at CDU. So there's a real need to consider gender more fully in coastal livelihood programs across the world, and particularly in Indonesia. And so the gender part of our ACR livelihood project was to look at what extent women and gender were considered in coastal livelihood programs, and what are the knowledge gaps and future opportunities, and sort of bearing in mind that this was a desktop scoping study. So it was a qualitative study conducted over about a year and a half with our colleagues in Indonesia and at Murdoch University. We undertook quite a comprehensive literature review, which is published in the ACR report. We had 3 workshops in Darwin, Bali and Lombok. Sadly, we can't have those sorts of meetings at the moment. And we went through a process of looking at, over the last 20 years, so from 1998 to 2017, coastal livelihood projects that had been implemented. There was about 32 in our initial group, and we cut that down to 20 projects that have been implemented by government, NGOs, international donors, ranging from sort of tens of thousands of dollars to multi-million dollars. We selected a group of projects that sort of represented a variety of implementing agencies, value and scale and geographical areas. And we basically looked at different project documents, mostly grey literature, to try and ascertain what were the outcomes of those projects in terms of achieving livelihood outcomes or benefits, what the gender approaches would be, what capacity building activity would be undertaken, some of the challenges and lessons learned and so on, and put that all into an Excel spreadsheet following the Sustainable Livelihoods framework, some of the key aspects of that. And in terms of the gender approach, we then considered the different projects and how they approached gender sort of based on this framework, which I don't really have time to go into today, but it's being used quite a lot now internationally in terms of looking at whether projects are reinforcing gender norms, whether they're accommodating them or leading to transformative approaches, so challenging gender norms and improving outcomes. This is sort of the summary results where we looked at different project activities that have been implemented involving men and women, and whether there'd been much gender awareness training in projects and the gendered approach. And this is the summary, a bit easier to read, but basically we found most of these 20 projects implemented anything from like AusAid to the World Bank to the Indonesian government to local NGOs. Almost half of them didn't have any real clear gender approach, and only a couple of the projects had been trying to progress a gender transformative approach, although on the one hand that's not surprising because sort of focus on that approach has really only been happening in the last 5 to 10 years. We also found that, you know, despite many of the organisations that have gender policies, and, you know, when you write a proposal, often in these contexts, you've got to outline what your gender strategy is going to be for implementation, that there really was only a lot of lip service paid to that in these projects. And when it came to evaluating the projects and looking at the evaluation reports, most projects, despite some of them being multi-million dollar projects, didn't really evaluate the gender components. So just to, you know, our paper sort of covers a lot more issues in detail in the discussion, looking at how, you know, gender is often conflated with women, limited consideration of work burdens on alternative livelihood development. I mentioned about many organisations have gender strategies, but it's not really realised in terms of their on-the-ground activities. Limited application of intersectional approaches that Jenny referred to, and that there's probably a lot more that can be learnt and applied in other agricultural settings, such as frameworks and training and approaches that have been used in, you know, crops and agriculture, or even in health, that can improve the consideration of gender in livelihood programs in Indonesia, and things like doing a lot more detailed social gender analyses at the start of project, integrating gender throughout the different stages of a project, a lot more training and awareness building for staff and communities, and shared learning of gendered project activities. So we found in evaluating those 20 projects that most projects didn't actually write anything about lessons learned from their gendered research. So that's it. Yes, thank you to ACR. And I just wanted to end with a slide. Recently, I put together this module for a handbook that the Secretary of the Pacific Community has published, which is part of a Pacific Handbook for Gender and Social Inclusion in Small-Scale Fisheries and Aquaculture. And this is sort of a bit of a how-to module designed for fisheries managers or fisheries practitioners in the Pacific that basically looks at how you can better integrate gender concerns into developing or enhancing livelihoods in communities in the Pacific. So that's part of, there's 8 different modules in this handbook, and livelihoods is one of them. So thanks.
Just as a conclusion, I've just got this slide up here. I'm aware that we've kind of run over time, so I'll just leave it here for something to discuss over some beers later, maybe at Fancy. But just to note that there's a few different areas that we can consider in environmental research relating to the kinds of data we collect and the questions we ask, up to the people in our research teams, and also issues on an organisational and institutional level here at CDU, which is not the scope of today, but if you would like to learn more about that, I just want to invite you to the RIEL & Co screening of the Picture a Scientist documentary, which is coming up.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we pretty much have run out of time, but on the other hand, it would be sad not to have a few questions. So if we can just have a couple of questions, ideally we should have one question for each panel member.
I'll ask this one to Natasha, if that's all right. But anyone can answer, of course. So I guess I'm tasked later today for the next 2 weeks with a page or a few where I think 4 things: climate change, gender, something and something are to be integrated, cross-cutting across a big project, yeah? And I think, I see, I guess in the last bunch of years and decades, gender's always, in these projects, considered as this, like, it's not a component. We have a conservation component, restoration, livelihoods, and then gender is this cross-cutting thing which helps tick the boxes of the donors and other people, and people agree to lip service, and some people genuinely believe like it's beneficial, it's going to contribute, it's going to make everything better. But it always gets like, you know, diluted at best, and in this cross-cutting setting. And is there more specific like recommendation for, maybe sometimes it comes down to what are the concrete activities or tools or methods to address gender issues in a project and integrate it and in a cross-cutting way or whatever? But what is the, you kind of, you broached it, but what is the, I don't know, what's the magic bullet to get it paid attention to more significantly? That's what I'm trying to ask. Thanks.
Money? Yeah, no, I think it's a combination of areas, but there are tools, but it's also about, you know, dedication of the project managers and the project leaders to actually integrate throughout the different stages of the project. Online has a question first, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So were you adding on to?
I was actually.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, if I may, money and education. Over the last few decades, women all over the world, certainly through these communities, and certainly in Indonesia, have been getting an education which has allowed them to become more assertive. Have we seen the effect of that assertion in the roles in the structure, social structure?
Oh, well, I can't answer that question, I'm afraid. But Ben, that's a big question. Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add to it, other than it's just a dedication to and a commitment to trying to integrate gender at each stage, to stop and look and reflect. And I mean, monitoring, I guess it comes down to monitoring too, doesn't it? Whether there's, which often gets left off generally in terms of all aspects of a project.
Does it, a real quick follow-up, does it help to dedicate resources to a gender specialist in the program?
Yeah, it does, but I think the practice is suggesting that, you shouldn't just give all the gender, shouldn't just employ the gender specialist at the start of the project and design the gender, you should try and, build that capacity across the whole project team and the community so everyone can start to come on board with it.
Gianna wants to add to that.
Gianna, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. Thanks, Ben, for the question. It's very applied. I'd like to, just to continue on this. I think it's really important to, particularly in the design phase, to, incorporate gender-specific objectives for the project, not just, measuring participation of men and women, but actually how the project intended to have some gender, gender equitable, in what area objectives. Doing a gender assessment at the start, internal, as Natasha was saying, in terms of the staffing and provide some gender training, but then also incorporating the indicators through the M&S system. I think that's very important. But often, when you're asked to support a project and you step midterm evaluation of the project, let's make it more gender proof. And then there has nothing been done since the start. It's very hard to be able to do, it really turns into a box ticking exercise. But I honestly believe that if, those goals and those gender assessments are done at the start and integrated in the design phase and then into the monitoring system, it can have impact and it's worthwhile doing. But you do need to, the leaders of the project need to prioritize, but just pay attention to that and act accordingly. And that's sometimes what gets sort of, unprioritized, I think. Thank you.
Meryl, can I hand over to you for your question?
I was wondering, I think this has been a really excellent session, and I particularly like the mixture of a bit of teaching as well as presenting the actual projects and the project results. And, how can we get this not just to the interested and committed, but to, more people at your university, at other places, etc. I was very struck recently by reading a paper on capacity building from the Pacific Communities annual Heads of Fisheries meeting, and they documented all the breakdowns of men and women who'd attended all the various technical courses and the social science courses, and there were roughly 70% of the course attendees on most of the technical, or all the technical courses were men, and 30% or fewer were women. But when it came to the gender course, it was exactly the other way around. So the people who weren't getting gender training were men. Now, I'm not saying that women don't need gender training as well, but we're just, in terms of training, results of this kind of work, what the project's about, opening up, as Jenny sort of said at the front, if you start to understand what gender is and where it's playing out in the economy, in politics, in management, in life, etc., you start to see what might change if there was more equality. But so how can this kind of event be taken further, maybe in a slightly different form, to a wider range of your colleagues?
Thank you so much, Meryl. It's Natasha here. I'm so glad you could join our seminar. And I also, before just addressing your question, wanted to acknowledge Meryl Williams. We can't see her online, but she's been a mentor to many of us and has been championing the gender and fisheries network internationally, and as well as doing lots of other activities. So yeah, without you, Meryl, most of us probably wouldn't be working in this space. So thank you so much for your leadership and contribution. I think for us here at CDU, in terms of our postgraduate program and our early career research program and our research enhancement program, we're sort of slowly realising that we should be offering more skill building and enhancement in looking at some of these issues as part of our package of research, training and methodology, and that's something I would actually like to, in my role and involvement in HDR, is something that I'd like to try and incorporate. So we do have a wider understanding and engagement, and so people working in the natural resource management but other areas can consider these issues and be open to them when they are doing their research. But Jenny, you might have something else to say?
Oh, stop there.
Oh,
sorry, I really believe we should stick to time. But I think it's a good place to stop because it's been a truly wonderful set of presentations. As a freshwater ecologist, I'm thinking about how I could incorporate gender a little bit more. But I'd like us all, but before I say thank you, we can continue outside at Drinks and Nibbles. So it's not really the end if you want to continue the discussion, but we should thank the panellists for a really stimulating, and Jenny, who I assume put it together, yes, for a very stimulating seminar. Thank you.